In Savannah, my grandfather used to work as a dockhand. He would tell us all kinds of stories from his years on the job. One tale involved a shipment of bananas from the Philippines or somewhere like that. Back then, bananas were transported in big bunches, still attached to the branches they grew on. The workers would open the boxes and carefully take out the bananas wearing thick gloves, which they used because of the tarantulas. The tarantulas didn't eat the bananas, but other smaller insects did, making the banana branches their home ground. Most of the time, the workers across the ocean would do everything they could to remove all the bugs from their product. But every now and then, a tarantula would hide in between the bunches after it had eaten its fill of bugs and managed to survive the entire transit process from whatever tropical island it came from to the ports in the United States. My grandfather recalled one time when he was working with a guy opening boxes of bananas. The guy started to relax a little too much, getting slow and chatting when he should be working. My grandpa turned around and saw that the guy had his arm stuck in a box, not paying attention to what he was doing. As soon as he turned around, he saw a huge hairy spider slowly crawling up the guy's arm. It was the biggest thing he had ever seen in all those years at work. The guy couldn't feel it because of the thick elbow-length gloves they wore to prevent spider bites and such. My grandpa froze in terror and just pointed his finger at the thing crawling up his arm. Only then did the guy pay attention to what he was doing, but it was too late. He saw the spider and let out a huge scream of terror that only managed to scare the spider even more. The tarantula, reacting on instinct, crawled up the guy's sleeve and then jumped right into his face. My grandpa said that the guy's second scream, the one he gave when the tarantula jumped on his face, was the loudest, scariest sound he had ever heard, like a death scream or something. The kind of sound one only makes when one is fearing for their life. My grandfather did the first thing that came to mind, which was to grab something to try and hit the spider off his face. He grabbed a broom and ran to his partner, but saw that the guy had already gotten the spider off of him and was running to the warehouse door. They went outside and closed the door behind them. My grandfather was checking to see if the guy was okay when he saw 2 large bite marks on the guy's cheek where the spider had bitten him. My grandfather was speechless with terror and just silently pointed at the marks. I think the guy hadn't realized he had been bitten, maybe because of the adrenaline or something, but a moment later, the guy put his hand to his face and, upon realizing he had been bitten, he passed out. My grandfather thought the guy was dead, that the spider's venom had gone straight to his brain and killed him on the spot, and now the same deadly spider was loose in one of the warehouses. So, my grandfather ran outside to warn everyone that his partner was dead and that there would be more deaths if they didn't get out of there as soon as possible. He began to yell at everyone to run for their lives because a deadly spider had just jumped out of a box and killed the guy he was working with, causing a complete panic on the docks. With half the guys running to save themselves and the other half organizing impromptu house parties to track down and kill the spider, the reality was that the guy who had been bitten wasn't dead at all. He had just passed out, as I said, but the area around the bite swelled up and turned red so quickly that even though the guy woke up and started walking around confused, that didn't calm the situation much. The reality was that even though the spider bites were pretty nasty, they weren't even close to being deadly. But since this was the 50s, when there were no science channels explaining these things, people just assumed that every tropical tarantula had a bite capable of killing a man in a matter of minutes. So, there were all these guys running around with any kind of weapon they could find until one of the bosses got wind of what was going on. He shut the place down for the night and called animal control. They sent a guy out to find and catch the spider before taking it to some museum or something to identify it. The guy who got bitten spent the night in the hospital and went back to work a few days later. We always enjoyed hearing that story, but the truth is that wasn't even the scariest or craziest story my grandfather had from his time as a summer laborer. He would tell the spider story at family gatherings with the younger children, and after simulating spider legs with the fingers of one hand, he would almost always get all the little girls running away all cleaned up while the boys were completely enthralled by the tale of a hairy monster. But then, when everyone went to bed or their parents drove them home, he would tell the wildest stories to the adults. Most of them were about co-workers sneaking their girlfriends to work and getting caught, or when they stole an entire case of whiskey because they noticed there was a mistake on one of the shipping manifests. The right thing to do would have been to just correct the manifest, but no, almost $10,000 worth of fancy whiskey disappeared, and everyone had a very Merry Christmas that year. But on one occasion, he told us a story of terror, real terror, during his first year as a dockhand. My grandfather worked with a guy named Crazy Al. Al was a war veteran. He had served in the army during World War II. The guys on the docks knew he had been to the Pacific Islands and had seen some pretty bad stuff, but that was it. Nobody ever asked Al about what he had seen or where he had fought because nobody wanted to bother him. And nobody wanted to bother him because, like I said, he was Crazy Al. My grandfather said that everyone felt sorry for him, but he wasn't particularly popular, partly because he was almost impossible to work with. Al couldn't stand loud noises and would attack anyone who accidentally startled him. So, instead of working in the warehouses like everyone else, my grandfather said that Crazy Al was in charge of the equipment room where people would go to get tools, safety harnesses, and such. You couldn't just walk right in. You had to gently knock on the door until Al came out to ask you what you wanted. That way, they kept Al at a safe distance from everyone. One day, a huge cargo ship pulled into the dock. They immediately noticed something was different about it. The boat, because some of the containers had different letters on them. It turned out that the ship had come from South Korea, and since the country was rebuilding after the war, my grandfather thought that this was one of the first Korean ships to dock in America in a long time. So, the ship docked, and 2 Korean officers came down the gangplank to greet the foreman in perfect English. They exchanged a few words, discussed unloading the ship, and then went back to their cabins while the dockers began to work. Sometime later, Al, the crazy one, came out of the equipment shed. Someone said that they saw him leave, and when he saw the ship floating at the dock, he just stared at it as if hypnotized. According to my grandfather, this person mentioned the episode of Al to a companion, but since he was already known as Al the Crazy One, nobody thought much about it. And so, the last time they saw him, he was walking down the dock with a crowbar in his hand, heading towards the gangplank of the Korean ship. Then, everyone on the dock began to hear screams coming from the ship, screams in Korean, and from the sounds, it seemed that some kind of fight was taking place. Then shots rang out, and everyone scattered and called the police. The police arrived with their guns drawn and boarded the ship, where they found Al shot to death with a crowbar in his hand, along with 2 Koreans beaten to death and 6 other Korean soldiers wounded, one of whom had shot Al with a pistol they had kept on board for emergencies. For years, everyone thought Al had mistaken Koreans for Japanese, one of the countries we had been at war with while Al was a soldier. But the truth was even more disturbing. Al had been a prisoner in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, an especially brutal one. He had watched his fellow prisoners tortured, executed, and slowly worked to death over 2 or 3 years. He learned to hate the camp guards, but not all of them were Japanese. As part of Japan's conquest of Asia, the Korean peninsula was included, and many Koreans were given the opportunity to prove their loyalty by serving as guards in prisoner of war camps. To prove how fanatically loyal they were, they treated American prisoners far worse than the Japanese themselves, as a way to gain favor with their new masters. Al probably had his own Korean guard in the camp, and whilst this doesn't excuse what he did to those poor sailors, it certainly explains why he became so murderous just by looking at them. People just kept thinking Al was crazy. He couldn't tell the difference between Koreans and Japanese. They called Al stupid, madder than a sewer rat, but to my grandfather and me, Al wasn't that crazy after all. Of course, he was disturbed, but there's a chilling clarity to the way he decided to get revenge. As my grandfather would tell it, Al was quiet. He didn't cross the dock shouting or waving the crowbar. He just walked calmly and silently, trying to commit a massacre without saying a word. And that little detail always leaves me cold. My name is Alex. I'm 23 years old, and I'm from East Loy here in Pennsylvania. So I know this probably doesn't qualify as a typical horror story, but it's something that's been bothering me for a long time, and if it scares me, I'm sure it'll scare you too. 3.5 years ago, a boy I went to school with murdered his grandparents. It happened the day after Christmas in 2021, and the news spread the next morning that a lovely elderly couple had been found stabbed to death in their own home. The police announced that they had arrested the person who did it, but for the first few days, they didn't reveal any details about who it was. Then, once they were sure that they were going to charge the person with murder, the police announced who it was: his own grandson. As you can imagine, Everyone was in shock when they found out, but what we wanted to know was why. Why kill your own grandparents in such a horrible way and just after Christmas? We had to wait a long time for the hearing, but in between, there were a lot of rumors about the motive for the murder. I think most people thought it was something to do with mental illness. So when the hearing started and the boy's lawyers said in court that he was hearing voices telling him to kill his grandmother and grandfather, there was a collective feeling of, I knew it. I understand why people would prefer to believe that. I also say, why else would anyone kill two people who loved him and cared for him? This kid was living with them at the time, and they cared for him, and they weren't abusive or anything. So, to do something that horrible, he had to be crazy, right? But no one that knew him thought that, at least no one that I knew. In fact, the kid had always been like that at school. Everyone called him James or Jay for short, and from then on, he was kind of a weirdo, but not the nice kind of weirdo, a real jerk. He was a bit of a goth. He loved rock music and was obsessed with horror movies. But none of the other goths at our school wanted to hang out with him because he was a total jerk. I'm sure the school had a name for the disorder he had, something like antisocial behavior disorder or something. But to us, he was just a jerk. Some of my friends grew up with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, whatever, but they were nice people, that kind of weirdo that's endearing. While Jay was just this arrogant guy with a severe case of protagonist syndrome. The last time I heard of Jay was when he changed his name from James to Vincent, and people wondered why until someone realized it was because he was obsessed with some vampire movie that had a character by that name. And that was Jay in a nutshell. He thought he was a lot better than he really was, when in reality he was just a sad phony. We thought he was just that, a total phony but relatively harmless, until he went and murdered his own grandparents, proving us wrong. At first, I came to believe that Jay had gone crazy because we started hearing stuff about how he heard voices and how he didn't really remember killing his grandma and grandpa, and that he just came back to himself after it happened. You see, after he did it, he went straight to the police station and told them everything. So to me, it did seem like he had a psychotic episode and then felt terrible about it. But then we heard something about how the reason Jay lost it was an argument over a Christmas basket. Someone had sent a basket with wine and cheese or something to Jay's grandparents, or maybe some small samples of whiskey. Either way, there was alcohol involved, and Jay decided that he wanted to keep it all for himself. He left very selfishly to his room with the liquor, and then his grandfather came upstairs to tell him to give it back. They started arguing. Ugly things were said, but Jay's solution was to grab a kitchen knife and stab his grandparents so deep that it left marks on their bones. Obviously, Jay's lawyers managed to sneak in the whole story about his supposed schizophrenia, and I read that a doctor agreed that he was unfit to stand trial. He never went to jail. Now he's in a mental institution, but I think that's exactly what he wanted. I don't care what any doctor says because anyone that knew him knows that Jay has always been like that. If he didn't get what he wanted, he would throw a tantrum, and that's basically why he had no friends at school too. I think his behavioral issues are the reason he ended up living with his grandparents in the first place. When he turned 18, his parents told him to get his act together or get out of the house, and his grandparents stepped in to take care of him. With all that in mind, I think what he did to them is even worse. They gave him a chance, and he gave them a chance. He returned the favor by stabbing them to death the day after Christmas. I don't think he feels any regret either. I don't think he regrets killing them because now he has to face the consequences of his actions. But that's all. The first thing he did after killing his grandparents was think, how can I make this make me look good? That was the exact same type of thing he did at school. Recently, me and some friends went to a local pub for some beers the day after Christmas, and I ended up meeting up with one of the goths I used to hang out with at school. At first, we exchanged a few words. Things like, how you been? What you been up to? But after a few drinks, the subject of Weird Jay came up, and he ended up telling me what happened. So, his group of friends would stop talking to him, and when he was done, I was picking my jaw up off the floor. They had been hanging out with Jay after school, walking through the school parking lot towards the bus stop for dismissal, when Jay grabbed a rock and threw it through the car window of a teacher he had a problem with that day. They all said something like, "But what the fuck are you doing?" Jay was laughing, and then they all ran out. The next day, they were all called to the principal's office where a police officer was waiting for them. Everything had been partially caught on camera, so the teachers knew more or less who they were. They just needed to confirm who had done it and why. The goth kids, when told it had been caught on camera, admitted that they were there when the window was broken, but they also told the truth when they said it was Jay's fault and that he did it out of nowhere. 1 second, they were walking together, talking, and the next, Jay was throwing a rock through the car window. All 4 goth kids said the same thing, but when it came to questioning Jay, he gave an excuse that sounds awfully familiar to me. He told the principal and the police officer accompanying him that the goth kids had forced him to do it. According to Jay, the kids threatened him with a beating if he didn't break the window, so to avoid a beating, he did what he was told. And that was Jay. Nothing was ever his fault. There was always someone to blame. Every situation he got into was unfair, and people conspired against him. I'm sure you're wondering by now why Jay wasn't expelled for smashing a teacher's window. The story goes that he was so convincing that the teachers didn't know who to believe. So instead of charging him formally or expelling him, Jay ended up with a 1-week suspension and was later reinstated. The other goth kids got the same punishment too. He obviously stopped hanging out with those goth kids. But it wasn't because they were bullying him. It was because he couldn't manipulate or control them. To me, I see exact parallels between what happened with the car window and what happened with his grandparents. He learned from a very young age that it's possible to manipulate the system, even when you've done something wrong. The guy I met in the pub said that after the window incident, Jay told him he was untouchable. He used that exact word. They never hung out with him again after that, earning him the title of the most arrogant asshole they ever had the misfortune of coming across. But Jay didn't just stay arrogant. He got worse and worse until he realized he couldn't manipulate them anymore, his grandparents, and simply killed them. If he had been sentenced to prison for 30 or 40 years, it wouldn't bother me that much, and I sure as hell wouldn't be writing this. But an absolute psychopath of the most infuriating and manipulative kind has managed to cheat the system and basically get away with murder. Instead of spending the rest of his life in a vulnerable prisoner unit where he should rightly be, getting what he deserves for murdering 2 old people who just wanted to look after him, Jay is living out the rest of his life in relative comfort, having completely cheated the system and won. And it scares me more than any horror story I've ever heard. My grandfather was in one of those wars. He turned 18 in December of '43 and was drafted almost immediately. He landed in France sometime in the fall of '44. His unit was a type of supply company that operated in the rear areas, so he didn't see much direct combat. All he did was load trucks, drive somewhere, and then unload them. Then, a few months later, the leader of Germany, as you know, blew his brains out and the war was over. But my grandfather's service wasn't over, and instead of coming home, like many of the hardened infantry battalions, my grandfather stayed in Germany and continued loading trucks. One day, some high-ranking officers came to my grandfather's unit and started asking about him. My grandfather's name was Murphy. He was Irish, but only on my great-grandfather's side, as his mother had been a German immigrant and had spoken to him quite a bit of the old language when he was a child. So much so that even though he couldn't speak German, he understood it perfectly. At the time, there was a huge demand for translators, so military intelligence was looking for anyone with even the slightest German ancestry in the hopes that they might be able to help translate documents or interpret conversations. But in my grandfather's case, he was given a very different kind of assignment. When they confirmed that my grandfather could understand enough German to be useful, the officer told him to get in his jeep, and they headed off to an intelligence unit where my grandfather and other soldiers were given a short briefing. In short, they were supposed to pose as guards at various POW camps, but their real job was simply to listen to anyone with a rank above private first class. Anyone who would receive a temporary demotion was all tasked with mastering the art of sounding very boring and very stupid. My grandfather said the first part was easy because most of the German prisoners talked about the same things the American soldiers talked about. They complained about the latrines, the food, and each other kind of harmless stuff. Then, one by one, depending on what they had done during the war, they were either hanged, forced to join labor gangs, or released. My grandfather said that over the months, the population of his camp began to dwindle more and more until rumors arose that they might shut it down completely. Then one day, hundreds of these SS soldiers marched up to the camp gates waving a big white flag and demanded surrender. It turns out that this rebel unit of Germany's most loyal guards had been hiding out in the woods for months. And when they weren't shooting at Americans, They were terrorizing the local Germans for collaborating with friendly US forces. The Allied forces had been trying to starve them into surrender, so it was thought that their surrender was simply the natural result of their efforts. But there was a problem. The number of guards in the camp had been reduced as the number of prisoners dwindled, which meant that when these SS soldiers showed up, there were 8 prisoners for every American guard in the camp. At first, the camp commandant was incredibly calm about this, as he saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate how just a handful of American boys could keep hundreds of SS prisoners under control. But he was wrong, and if it hadn't been for my grandfather, a lot of people would have paid with their lives. My grandfather said that one day he was on guard when, for the first time during his entire stay in the camp, he heard something that sounded vaguely suspicious. All of these hardened SS prisoners had been behaving perfectly well. Not one of them had put a foot wrong. But then, after my grandfather overheard one say to another, "How much longer will we have to wait?" grumbled, that was a fairly common question among the prisoners. The other answered, "We waited for the signal." Obviously, my grandfather thought, "What signal?" But he had also been explicitly ordered to report anything of that sort to his superiors. Words like plan, plot, or code were all of great interest, as the main aim at that time was to prevent war criminals from escaping or destroying evidence of their crimes. But signal was something completely different. As soon as his superiors heard that someone had mentioned the word signal, they filled the camp with extra guards and then asked my grandfather to point out the soldiers he had heard saying it. Sometime later, I imagine after a long period of interrogation, one of the SS men finally spoke up and revealed his whole crazy plan. You see, all those SS fanatics could have turned up waving a white flag, but they hadn't actually surrendered. As I mentioned, they had been hiding in the area for months, following Germany's last order to fight to the bitter end. They had never attacked the prisoner camp because it was full of Germans, and they didn't choose to set up camp either. Some kind of escape, but by then, that didn't matter anymore. So one day, some SS scouts approached the camp and noticed that there were only a handful of prisoners, but, more importantly, there were only about 24 guards and staff in the camp. They reported this to their commander, who devised an extremely risky plan to fake a surrender, overpower the camp guards, and then loot the weapons and ammunition to continue their fight as partisans against the Americans. But the SS didn't just want weapons and ammunition. Oh no, they had a much bigger prize in mind: the American uniforms. If they could disguise themselves as Americans in immaculate uniforms, the SS could mount devastating attacks against our troops, especially if they had an SS soldier disguised as, say, an American officer, of which there were quite a few among the camp staff. Upon hearing that word, signal, and mentioning it to their superiors, my grandfather saved countless lives. So many that his superiors sought to award him a Bronze Star. I thought they only gave those medals out for heroism in combat, but it turns out they also gave them for other things, as long as they have to be really significant acts to be considered. All this made him a minor celebrity amongst the lads he served with, and about 6 months later, he was discharged and sent home. My granddad never considered himself a hero. He always said he was just doing his job. But I have the medal and the citation to prove that he saved, and I quote, dozens if not hundreds of lives. And for me, that is about the definition of a hero as it is possible to get. One particular story my granddad told me last year really stuck with me. He was living in Britain during World War II when the Blitz of London happened. He remembered seeing a German plane drop a bomb on the high street in Lewisham while he was working there as a cinema projectionist. As the street was so wide, the German plane was able to come down between the buildings themselves. All the employees at the cinema where he worked used to be air raid spotters, so when they sent up flying bombs like that, he and his mates would have to go up on the roof and get ready. One time, there was a buzz bomb coming straight at him, and he pressed the button to activate the alarm and alert passersby below. Luckily, the motors were designed to shut off, so the bomb dove and hit Lisa Market about 200 meters further up the street. So he and a couple of his friends went to try and help with the wounded. There were about 52 dead and several hundred wounded, and he helped carry stretchers. He said there were people with no arms, no legs, and no heads. Another time, he said he saw people trapped in a burning building after a bombing, but there was nothing he could do to help them. After that, he never boiled water again in those old whistling kettles. He would always fill a pot and set it to boil like he was making soup or something. My grandmother learned her lesson the hard way when she used a whistling kettle and then walked into the living room to see my grandfather curled up on the floor with his hands over his ears. He said the whistling reminded him of all the people screaming inside the burning building. My grandfather is a real straight-up conservative guy, the last person you would expect to have been a big hippie in his youth. He used to be a bitnik, as they called them back then, but after getting bored of the beret and the lively poetry, he grew his hair and beard out, got a motorcycle, and set off into the horizon. He went everywhere, traveling all over Canada, the United States, and down through Central and South America, all the while carefully maintaining an old BSA bike. He has some pretty crazy stories from those years, but none as spooky as this one. My grandfather traveled south through Mexico, funded by money he had made in Canada, where he worked as a motorcycle taxi driver in remote areas during the fall. He has tons of stories from his time in the Great White North, but for now, I'll just focus on this one. My grandfather would go from place to place, sometimes staying in pretty nice places. But the further you went into remote areas, the more you had to resort to what the Mexicans call inns. Inns are basically like little inns or taverns, but on a much smaller scale than you might imagine. Sometimes they're just an extra room in someone's house, and for a small fee, the owners offer you a small breakfast. My grandfather stayed in many of these inns while driving through Mexico and even went back to a few on the return trip. But there was one in particular that he swore he would never go back to as long as he lived. He said that inn had a shared sleeping area, and that during his stay there, a group of European travelers were also staying there. There were 2 Spanish girls and a Dutch guy, all traveling together after graduating from college or something. My grandfather said they were nice people, and he chatted with them a little before everyone went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, he woke up to the sound of screaming. Someone turned on the light, and they found one of the Spanish girls sitting up in bed crying. She was missing a large chunk of hair, and when they looked under her bed, they found the lock of hair just lying on the floor. My grandfather says the girl was hysterical for several minutes, so no one could figure out what had happened until she calmed down a bit. But when she finally spoke, what my grandfather heard terrified him. The girl told how she had a nightmare where someone was pulling her hair, and then the next thing she knew, she woke up, and part of her scalp felt a terrible burning pain. She put her hand on her head and said that she felt like a part of her hair was loose. Connecting that feeling with the dream she had just had, she got so scared that she just lost control. Everyone was asleep when she woke up, and there was nothing moving around her, so the confusion of not knowing who had ripped her hair out only increased her fear. My grandfather said that no one was able to go back to sleep that night, and they stayed awake until dawn before getting back on the road as soon as there was enough light to do so. My grandfather said that he saw no sign of the innkeeper when they left, but as he was riding away on his motorcycle, he caught a glimpse of someone watching him from the window of what must have been his bedroom. There was no way they hadn't heard the Spanish girl's screams. They were in the middle of nowhere, and the rest area wasn't too far from their bedroom, maybe 20 or 30 meters across the yard. My grandfather said it was as if they knew to stay away from the rest area, which gave him the certainty that he was supposed to stay away from that place completely. One time, I asked him what he thought happened. Who ripped the Spanish girl's hair out, and he just sighed and told me the world is full of wonderful, beautiful people, but also some really sick ones. To say that that stuck with me would be an understatement.